My daughter-in-law called me at 8:17 on a Tuesday night. I remember that because I had just poured myself a cup of coffee. She said, "Dad, we sold the lake house last month. We forgot to tell you." I didn't answer her. I just stood there holding the mug. 5 seconds, maybe 6. Then I said, "Congratulations, dear." "Best of luck," she said, "thanks," and hung up. I looked at the coffee after that. It was still steaming. I never drank it. The lake house wasn't just some property my son happened to use. My wife and I bought it 31 years ago, back when our son was still in high school, and money was tighter than it is now. 2 bedrooms, 1 old bathroom, a screened porch that rattled whenever the wind came across the lake. My wife loved that porch. She'd sit there before breakfast with a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of tea in both hands. After she died, I couldn't go there for almost a year. My son asked if he and his family could use it. I said yes. Then they used it again, and again. After a while, I stopped thinking of it as mine. That was probably the first mistake. The second was trusting the sentence my daughter-in-law had just said. "We forgot to tell you." I knew they hadn't forgotten. The next morning, my son called. He said, "Dad, you talked to her?" "Yeah." He didn't say anything. I asked, "Did you really sell the lake house?" "Yes." "When?" "Last month." "Why didn't you tell me?" He sighed. "Dad, it was complicated." I looked at the clock. 7:41. I said, "How much did you sell it for?" He went quiet. Then he said, "That's not important." I laughed once, not because anything was funny. I just didn't know what else to do. Whose name was on the sale? Dad. Whose name? We handled it. That answer bothered me more than the sale. My son had always been terrible at hiding things from me. He'd get quiet. Then he'd rub the side of his thumb with his finger. He was doing it now. I said, "Did you sign something?" "Of course." "Did I?" He didn't answer. I felt my hand tighten around the phone Marnes. Then he said, "You gave us permission years ago." "No, I didn't. You said we could use it." "Use it isn't sell it." "I know." His voice changed. Then he said, "We're doing this for the kids." That sounded familiar. My daughter-in-law had said almost the exact same thing whenever I questioned something. The kids need this. The kids need that. Better schools, more room, a safer neighborhood. I had heard it so many times that I stopped arguing, but there was something my son didn't know. My wife had talked to me about the lake house shortly before she died. Very clearly. She was sick then. She couldn't walk far without getting tired, but she could still remember every detail about that property. She told me, "Whatever happens, don't let them talk you into signing anything." I asked, "Who?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "Anybody." I laughed. I told her our son would never try to take the house. She looked at me for a long time. She didn't argue. That's what I remember. She just looked at me. 3 weeks later, she was gone. I put the conversation away in my head, or I thought I did. After my son hung up that morning, I went into the garage. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I moved an old lawnmower, then a box of Christmas lights, then a plastic bin full of my wife's sewing things. At the back was an old metal filing cabinet. The bottom drawer was stuck. I pulled it twice. It finally opened. There were tax records in there, insurance papers, receipts. Then I saw my wife's handwriting on a yellow folder. I hadn't opened it in years. I took it to the workbench. Inside was the original deed. My name, my wife's name, everything exactly as I remembered it. Then I found another document. It was dated 18 months ago. I read the first paragraph, then the second. My name was on the bottom. There was a signature underneath it. I stared at it for a long time. It looked like mine, almost. But it wasn't. My wife used to tease me about my handwriting. She said I made my capital R too narrow. The R on this signature was wide, very wide. I turned the page over. There was a notary stamp. Then I saw the address. I knew that office. It belonged to the real estate company my son had been using. I was still holding the paper when the garage door started opening. I turned around. My son walked in. He looked at the folder, then at me. He didn't ask what I had found. He just said, "Dad, you weren't supposed to have that." For a few seconds, I just looked at him. He looked at the folder. Then he said, "Where did you find that?" "In my garage." "Dad, give it to me." "No." He stopped. I don't think I'd ever said that to him quite like that. He took a breath. "You're misunderstanding what that is." "Then explain it." He looked at the document. "I can't do that here." "Why not?" He rubbed his forehead, because Mom was involved. That got my attention. I said, "Don't put this on your mother." "I'm not. You just did." He looked toward the garage door. Then he said, "She knew there were financial problems." "Whose?" He didn't answer. I waited. Finally he said, her family. I knew immediately who he meant. My daughter-in-law's brother had started some kind of real estate business a few years earlier. I'd never paid much attention to it. He'd asked my son for money once, maybe twice. My son had told me not to worry about it. I said, "What does he have to do with my lake house?" My son looked down. "Nothing. That was too quick," I said. "Then why did you mention him?" He didn't answer. I put the document back in the folder. He stepped toward me. "Dad," I closed the folder. "No, you don't understand." "Then make me understand." He shook his head. "You'll make this worse." "For who?" He didn't answer. That was when I knew this wasn't about a simple sale. I told him to leave. He stood there for another few seconds. Then he said something I'll never forget. "If you open that file, you won't be able to put the family back together." I said, "I didn't tear it apart." He looked at me. "I know." Then he walked out. I waited until his car disappeared. After that, I called a lawyer. His name was Martin Hale. I'd never used him before, but a neighbor had recommended him years earlier. I explained what I had. He asked me one question. "Do you have the original?" "Yes." "Don't let it leave your hands," I said. "Why?" "Because if somebody forged one document, there may be others." That was the first thing anyone had said that made sense. The next morning, I took everything to his office. He spread the papers across his desk. He looked at the original deed first. Then the transfer document. Then the notary information. He didn't say much. Finally, he asked, "Do you know who purchased the property?" "My son says a couple bought it." Martin looked at me. "Your son told you that?" "Yes." He turned his computer toward me. The buyer wasn't a couple. It was a company. A company I'd never heard of. I asked, "Who owns it?" Martin searched for a few seconds. Then he leaned back. "Your daughter-in-law's brother." I didn't say anything. I just stared at the screen. Martin said, "There's more." There usually was. The company had borrowed money against the property. "A lot of money?" I asked. "How much?" He told me. I looked out his office window. Cars were moving along the street below. People were going to work, buying lunch, picking up their kids. Nobody knew that my son had apparently used my wife's lake house to secure somebody else's debt. I said, "Why would they need my house?" Martin didn't answer. He looked back at the document. Then he said, "I think that's the wrong question. What should I ask? Who thought you wouldn't notice?" That stayed with me, because they hadn't just sold something without telling me. They had counted on me not checking. They had counted on me being 62, living alone, trusting my son, and not wanting trouble. And maybe, for a while, they were right. Martin asked if I had anything else from my wife. I told him about the conversation before she died. He asked if she'd left any notes. I remembered the yellow folder dame. There was a small handwritten note tucked behind the deed. I hadn't noticed it before. It said, "Keep the original. If they say I agreed, ask them to show you when." I read it twice. Martin read it once. Then he looked at me. "Your wife knew someone might say she agreed to this. She knew something." "Yes." I took the note back. There was one more thing I hadn't told him. My wife had given me a small digital recorder near the end of her life. I still had it. She'd said, "Keep this somewhere safe." I had no idea why. I thought it was one of those things she did when she was worried about forgetting something. That evening, I found it in the back of the same filing cabinet. The batteries were nearly dead. I pressed the button. Static. Then my wife's voice. Very faint. "Don't sign anything." I leaned closer. Then I heard my son's voice. "Mom, Dad doesn't have to know yet." I stopped breathing for a second. There was a pause. My wife said something I couldn't make out. Then another voice came through. A man's voice. I recognized it. My daughter-in-law's brother. He said, "If the transfer goes through, the lender won't ask questions." I stopped the recording. I sat there alone in my garage. The house hadn't been sold because my son needed money to do endured. The house had been used because somebody needed collateral, and my son had known enough to keep me out of it. But there was still one thing I didn't understand. Why had my wife known about this 7 years earlier? I didn't play the recording again that night. I wanted to. But I was afraid I'd hear something that would make it impossible to give my son the benefit of the doubt. The next morning I called Martin. I told him about the recording. He said, "Bring it in." I did. He listened with headphones. He didn't interrupt it. When it finished, he took the headphones off and sat there for a moment. Then he said, "There's another recording." "What?" He pointed at the little recorder. "There's more than one file." I looked at him. "I didn't know that." He pressed a button. Another recording started. This one was shorter. My wife's voice was clearer. She said, "If you're hearing this, something happened that I was afraid of." Then she paused. "I don't want you fighting with our son." I looked at Martin. He kept listening. My wife continued, "He thinks he's helping them." He doesn't understand the debt. Then another voice. My son. Mom, they said it'll only be temporary. My wife said, nothing involving that house is temporary. The recording ended. I sat there. My son hadn't planned to steal the house. Not at first. He had apparently agreed to help. And somewhere along the way, helping had turned into something else. Martin asked me what I wanted. I said, I want the property protected. He nodded. And I want my son's name cleared if he didn't forge the signature. That's reasonable. I looked at him. He's still my son. Martin didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We started working quietly. I didn't call my daughter-in-law. I didn't call her brother. I didn't warn my son. I went home and found one more thing my wife had left behind. A sealed envelope. It was inside an old sewing pattern box. I recognized her handwriting immediately. My name was on it. Inside was a letter and a photocopy of the original deed, but the photocopy had something written across the bottom, a number. Martin called it a document reference number. He used it to contact the title company that had handled our original purchase to him. They still had the original closing file, and that file contained something I hadn't known existed. My wife's signature card. Mine too. The difference between my real signature and the forged one was obvious. There was no guessing, no argument, no opinion Noah. The title company put it in writing. The transfer document could not be authenticated. That changed everything. The sale was challenged. The lender froze the money. The company that had supposedly bought the lake house suddenly couldn't prove clean ownership. Then my daughter-in-law called me. Her voice was shaking. Dad, please don't do this. I said, do what? You know. No, tell me. She started crying. Then she said, we were trying to help my brother. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not the kids, not the schools, her brother. I asked, did my son know? She was quiet. Then she said, he knew about the loan. I said, did he know about the signature? No. I believed her. That didn't make what he'd done okay. But it mattered. A week later, my son came to my house. He stood in the kitchen where he'd sat at my table 1,000 times growing up. He looked tired. He said, Dad, I thought I could fix it before you ever knew. I said, you should have told me. I know. You could have lost everything. I know. Why didn't you? He looked down. Because I was embarrassed. That was probably the most honest answer he'd given me. He wasn't trying to sound brave. He wasn't blaming his wife. He wasn't blaming me. He had made a bad choice because he thought he could fix somebody else's problem quietly. Then the problem got bigger. The lake house came back to me. The transfer was canceled. The lender went after the company that had borrowed against the property. Her brother had to deal with the debt himself. My daughter-in-law never apologized in a way that satisfied me. Maybe she couldn't. She kept saying she was protecting her family. I suppose in her mind she was. My son and I still talk. Not the way we used to. There are things between us now that weren't there before. But he calls. I answer. That's enough for now. I went back to the lake house last fall. The porch still needed paint. The old refrigerator still had a faint blue mark from the fish my grandson had drawn years ago. I stood there looking at it. Then I sat in my wife's chair. I brought the original deed with me. I didn't need to. Martin had copies. The title company had copies. The county had copies. But I wanted to hold it. That was all. I thought about that Tuesday night. Dad, we sold the lake house last month. We forgot to tell you. 5 seconds. That's how long I stayed quiet. I used to think those 5 seconds were because I didn't know what to say. Now I think I was remembering. Remembering my wife's handwriting. Remembering the folder. Remembering the little recorder she told me to keep. And remembering that she'd known, long before I did, then one day somebody might try to make me believe something I never agreed to. I still have that recorder. It's sitting in my desk drawer now that. The batteries are dead. I haven't replaced them. I don't need to two-way. The lake house is still there, so is my wife's chair Machi. And every once in a while I sit on that porch early in the morning with a cup of coffee. It gets cold before I finish it. I don't mind. I think some things are easier to leave alone once you've finally learned where they belong.